Hi, I'm Brian Katulis. I'm Vice President of Policy here at the Middle East Institute. And I'm happy you're joining our discussion today examining President Biden's trip to the Middle East later this week. Before I introduce the panel and the topic, I wanted to say a few words about the Middle East Institute and the activities that we have ongoing here at MEI. MEI is the oldest Washington-based institution dedicated solely to the study of the Middle East. We were founded in 1946, and our mission is to increase knowledge of the Middle East among citizens of the United States and to promote a better understanding between the people of these two areas. We work to advance this mission through a range of activities. We have programs in arts and culture that include regular exhibitions in our art gallery on site here in Washington, D.C. We also host language classes in Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Turkish, and other Middle East languages. And our library out back here, if you come by, as the largest English language collection of literature of the Middle East in Washington, D.C., outside of the Library of Congress. Our policy center grounds its approach in independent, nonpartisan analysis, and we seek to find solutions to the region's most challenging issues. We have a deep connectivity across the region, from North Africa into the Gulf, all the way up to Turkey, and we include also Afghanistan and Pakistan in that. We work to include a wide range of perspectives in our analysis with the goal of trying to elevate the quality of the debate through clinical analysis in papers and in events like we're hosting today. If you look at our calendar of events just this week, later this week on Wednesday, we are co-hosting a conference on the ISIS detainee challenges in Syria and potential solutions. On that same day, we're also co-hosting a webinar chat with the Lebanese Deputy Prime Minister about the financial crisis in Lebanon. The next day, on Thursday, we have a webinar on Egypt's hosting of the UN Climate Conference this fall, featuring the Egyptian government's point person on climate, among other experts. And then we'll close out the week on Friday with a webinar on the effects of the Russia-Ukraine war on global food supply. So we're working hard here to offer independent views that hopefully, again, try to elevate and broaden the understanding about the challenges we're facing today. Today's discussion is focused on President Biden's visit. President Biden this week is making his first trip as president to the Middle East, with stops in Israel, the West Bank, and Saudi Arabia. He'll travel to Israel and to Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank on Wednesday and Thursday. And then he'll fly to Saudi Arabia to meet with leaders from the region at a regional conference, as well as meet with Saudi King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Last week here at MEI, we published a special briefing with about a dozen essays from analysts on our team, analyzing different facets of this trip and what to expect and what to look for in the region. And today we're lucky to have 4 of those authors join us in a discussion about what to expect from President Biden's trip to the Middle East. I don't know if you saw that last weekend, this past weekend, President Biden published an opinion article in the Washington Post over the weekend, and he outlined a broad range of things that he aims to address in this trip, covering all the topics that we're going to talk about today. But he outlined and framed his trip as an effort to start a new and promising chapter of American engagement in the Middle East. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. We're going to talk for a little bit amongst ourselves. We'll be looking for your questions in the chat, and we're keen on engaging all of you. First, let me start with Karen Young, who is a senior fellow and our founding director of the program on economics and energy here at the Middle East Institute. She'll discuss the energy market dynamics and also the economic implications of what to expect in the Middle East and from Biden's trip. She'll be followed by Mick Mulroy, who's a non-resident senior fellow here at MEI. He's as well an ABC News national security analyst and a co-founder of the Lobo Institute. And Nick has a long career of service in the US government in many positions. Khaled Al-Gindi will speak to the Israel-Palestine leg of the trip. Khaled is the senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and he also directs the MEI program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. And then last but not least, Alex Vitanka, the founding director of our Iran program, We'll talk about not only the Iran aspects of President Biden's trip to the Middle East, but also what that means for broader regional cooperation and next steps for U.S. policy. So turning to you, Karen, first, your essay was entitled Focus on Energy Security, Not Oil Production. And you delve into many of the things that we should look to expect, not just for the visit, but I think importantly after the visit, and what are the broader trends. And one thing you highlight is that the Middle East, especially the oil producing part of the Middle East, will likely will try to meet the broader needs of an emerging market energy transition taking place in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And I think your essay sets things up quite nicely. How do you see, and what should we expect both on the energy markets and then also the broader economic dynamics, not only in the region itself, but the world?
Well, thank you, Brian. It's really good to be with you all on the panel today. I think as much as there's been a focus on Saudi Arabia as a potential source of additional oil production that could maybe ease tight markets and eventually gasoline prices in the US, I think that short-term view is pretty unrealistic, but it's also now maybe less pressing. And that's because we are seeing some, sort of movement towards perhaps a global recession. And OPEC, hasn't really asked for an external consultant in the White House from the administration. And that's something that was mentioned in the president's op-ed in the Post over the weekend. And I thought that was really interesting that he would pose that. I think the president may find that the global economy and particularly actions of our Federal Reserve Board are doing more of the work for him to potentially ease high oil prices. The global economy is definitely showing signs of a slowdown. Oil demand is expected by many analysts, most bearish among them, Citibank, to decline. Citibank's estimates of a price drop are even to $60 a barrel by the end of the year. For comparison, HSBC is projecting around $100 or under $100 a barrel for next year. So there's debate among traders and analysts, but the general trend line is looking like a downward one. Interestingly, Russia continues to pump a lot of oil and get it to market despite sanctions from the European Union and surging insurance costs. So the tightness that we have been experiencing could begin to look more like a cushion. And that's really hard to know. And that's part of the, I think, definitely will be part of the discussions, but part of what I think the administration needs to take a bit of a softer approach about. So in these two pieces, I wrote one for MEI and one for Arabian Gulf Business Insights. I did argue that the US and President Biden have an opportunity to take a longer term view with Saudi Arabia and also the UAE on future energy security needs. And this is what I was describing as more of an emerging market focus, because that is where energy demand growth will be, not necessarily oil demand growth, but energy demand growth. And I think the Gulf states they understand this, they've internalized this very well, and we would be remiss not to recognize the Gulf role there. My expectation, however, is that this visit will not do that. So with some important exceptions, which I'll note, I don't think it's going to be a focus also on short-term oil supply for the reason I just mentioned, this understanding of a slowdown. But I think this summit with other GCC leaders and MENA leaders will be a security summit. And I think that's too bad, because it plays into a very established comfort zone of US engagement in the Middle East. Our wheelhouse is a security one. What we miss is an understanding of what the region has the capacity to do with its own economic resources and its own interests that can be much more impactful and powerful for our global security and economic growth needs. So I think this trip will end up building a basic counter-Iran war council, heavily influenced by Israeli strategy. It'll probably do more to increase militarization and arms races in the region. That trend line was already in process. But I think, the risk there is that if we increasingly mount towards a confrontation stance with Iran, our energy market problems today will pale in comparison to what could come. I think we are, there are some limited expectations on economic cooperation measures that we could amplify and celebrate in this visit. And one is on this I2U2 initiative, which is kind of a quad group: Israel, India, the US, and the UAE. Their meeting with their virtual meeting will be on Thursday, I believe, and they're going to focus on issues like food security. And this is good because it presents a model of U.S. engagement with countries in the region, bridging Asia and the Middle East. It builds a sort of a pattern of regional cooperation, of problem solving, where the U.S. is at the table, but not necessarily at the head of the table. So I think that's really important. We'll hear more also about Israeli investment in the region, co-investments as a result of the Abraham Accords. And there's good potential there as well, particularly on gas production and new technology. But thinking more solidly, I think the opportunity is that the U.S. can start preparing for three major trends in energy security affecting the Middle East and our global economy. Now is a critical moment to engage and reflect on the role of the Gulf states in shared global energy security challenges. The Gulf states have already really internalized the process of an impending energy transition, meaning that they know there's a diminishing demand for their most important resource revenue sources. They've already changed a lot about their labor markets, the way they access capital, and the way they think about the role of the state and the economy. So there's three trends that I identified in the brief. Are the first really that oil and gas producers are going to become more disaggregated within the region. So in terms of their access to capital, their fiscal space for social support, their ability to direct hydrocarbon revenues to invest in domestic climate goals. And so this is really how, two or three of the Gulf producers are really set apart. So Qatar on gas, Saudi Arabia and the UAE on oil. And these are the states that have the capacity to really dominate the region in a lot of ways, particularly in the investment space, and to drive an agenda on climate adaptation. So we need to be mindful of that and to engage them. The second trend is on gas markets. I think that will boost the importance and the profile of producers, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is really shifting the intra-regional dynamics among producers and their regional investment partners. And this is where the UAE investment in Israeli gas production is a really interesting kind of example, as well as new partnerships between Israel and Egypt. So this is new relationships with the EU. This is, really changing sort of the landscape and the willingness of states to work together. The third trend line is more in the aid space. The development agenda of the Middle East, I think, is becoming more global in reach and outlook, driven by these three most important and financially resourceful states. And they'll be seeking new markets for their energy products, oil and gas, but also hydrogen, petrochems. And this has really important implications for the wider region, but also for Africa and South Asia. And I think this means that pan-Arab support is less of a guide to aid and investment, as traditionally that has been. So this has implications, of course, for Palestine. And we're seeing more of a kind of what I would call a return on investment calculation in a lot of these decisions. So we can talk more in specifics about current oil demand and production capacity among OPEC and OPEC plus. But I think the focus on the short term is really to the detriment of longer term trends that are happening among Gulf producers, and the kind of relationship building that the U.S. could do now to help build bridges that we're going to need in the future. And we don't have to agree on everything with our partners in the Gulf, but some basic recognition of Gulf capacity in energy, security, economic resources, I think would temper our own expectations of American engagement in the decade to come.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Mick, turning to you to talk about some of the defense and security issues. And Karen talked about some trends in the energy markets that she outlines in her essay. And one trend we've seen in the region, and when you served in office over in the Pentagon in your last position, there was this step towards an effort to create an Arab NATO. And there is certainly a trend towards greater regionalization, regional integration, if you will, on some of the defense security cooperation fronts. Israel is now a member of CENTCOM. There's a report almost every day about efforts to perhaps expose things that have been happening behind the scenes, but or maybe it's new initiatives to get new partners to deal with shared security threats. Based on what you wrote last week in this special briefing, and also if you could mention a bit of what our colleague Bilal Saab, who wasn't able to join us, who runs our defense program here, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what are these trends that you see in the region, and then what you expect from President Biden's visit this week on those topics.
Absolutely, Brian, and it's great to be with you, my fellow guests, and everybody out there. Thanks for MEI for hosting it. And I start also with agreeing with Karen that although I'm the security guy, I definitely think that the conversations they're having should be much broader than just military hardware and what we can do. It's part of it, what we can do together, security for all countries involved, but it should be much broader. And I will definitely touch on the Arab NATO, or what we kind of called the Middle East Strategic Alliance when I was in the Pentagon. So I did write an article, as you referenced. I said the leader of the free world needs to lead it. And I think that's the primary point I'm driving at here. And from the president's op-ed in the Washington Post, I think they're very much aligned. Essentially, this is a very consequential part of the world. It has been, it is now, and it will be in the future. And it's important for the United States to focus on that, both for our security, both economic and physical, as well as economic security as well. So I think it's absolutely what the United States should be doing. We should obviously include human rights in all of our discussions in our foreign policy, but we can't just opt out of being that leader if we claim that title, so to speak. And I think that's something very important that we need to do. So what do we get out of it? We have in our national security strategy that we have strategic competitors, China, Russia. That is something that I think plays out globally. It's not confined to the geographic regions of those two countries. They are trying to gain influence and are gaining influence in the Middle East and Africa. We need to compete there, just like we need to compete every other place in the world. So I think that is a key component. I have told my colleagues, although I understand and agree with the prioritization of China being the top, that the word pivot probably should just be jettisoned from our vocabulary. To many of our partners out there, pivot physically means turning away from them, even turning your back on them. And that's not, I don't think, what we're trying to say. We simply have a higher priority. But that doesn't mean that we are leaving or uninterested in the region. So I think that's important. We need our strategic partners, as the president called them, to be able to strategically compete with the likes of China and Russia. Another point I would say with Iran, there's a lot to be talked about when it came to the original agreement in 2015, good and bad. There's a lot to be talked about with the decision to withdraw from it in 2018 and the maximum pressure campaign that came after it. But the simple fact of the matter are we are where we are. And Iran is, by the Secretary of State's own public comments, fairly close to being able to get enough nuclear material to create a nuclear weapon. And so that has to be part of the conversation, because complaining about past things are really not relevant when it comes to an Iran on the brink of having a nuclear weapon and what that could mean for the region, arms races, as Lori brought up, but also, the potential for preemptive type actions, which could set the whole region into a conflict, which would be not in anyone's interest. So I think we have to take this opportunity to talk to all our key partners about what are we going to do, not just what are we going to complain about from past, what are we going to do. And the other thing I brought up in my essay that I think we get out of this that we want, and we certainly put it as a high priority, this administration, and I'm glad they did, is ending the conflict in Yemen. So we have a ceasefire that's lasted and now has continued. That is a great thing. We need to ensure that we do everything, talking to our partners, to make sure that is the case, to give space to those, and I used to help advise them, to give space to those that can come up with a longer lasting peace there that will bring that country out of the grips of being what the UN's called the most serious humanitarian disaster. So lastly, I would, of course, bring up what is in it for them. I think all those things are a benefit to them. But specifically, as Bilal pointed out, I think we are the partner of choice. I'm biased, of course, but I think you can see that playing out in other parts of the world, specifically Ukraine. When it comes to our methods of fighting, our methods of working with coalitions, and of course, the quality of weapon systems that we do possess. All of this is something that I think our partners see, they knew about, but now they see very much right in front of them. And I think we should highlight that. And as Bilal points out, he talks about the integrated air missile defense systems that they all would like, and they would all like to see built. I think that we're going to be the key player in that, and I can see the benefit of that. If not, and one of the things we could use that for, as Bilal does point out, is to try to prevent this a race, essentially, when it comes to ballistic missiles, which if you pair that with nuclear capabilities, then you have, probably the worst case scenario when it comes to an arms race, a nuclear arms race with the means to deliver it throughout the region. So I think that is very important. Specifically to your point out, Brian, on the NATO or the Arab NATO, as was kind of shorthand. From my experience with MESA, there just wasn't a lot of interest in all of it, which was political, economic, and security. I was on the security side, so obviously I saw it from that perspective. But most of the non-controversial parts were the security. I could see that being a basis for what the U.S. can do on the security front going ahead, which is building out this air missile defense, maritime security, ensuring the waterways remain open for international trade, counterterrorism, other parts that we worked together at. We were going to create these centers of training that existed throughout the region. So if that is something that they're looking at, I certainly do see that being effective, and from my past experience, something that they were interested in. So I'll stop there and come back to you, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Mick. And both you and Karen, I think, have some common threads there. I think you both agree that the agenda should not just be on military and the security front, as you affirmed, and that we should try to take a longer term approach, that a lot of these issues, we shouldn't look for solely short-term quick wins, because there really are none to be had in today's landscape in the Middle East. And I think that's an interesting message and an important one about broadening U.S. engagement in the Middle East, rather than, and we've had a debate here in America, which is understandable after 20 years, of either pulling back or, as you mentioned, the word pivot. And I think that's what's interesting about this Biden visit, is it opens the opportunity, at least I think, for deepening engagement on a broad set of issues, not just the military ones. So having heard from Karen and Mick on some region-wide issues, energy, economics, defense and security cooperation, we're going to delve in a little bit on the two legs of the trip somewhat, and what are key issues on each leg. And I want to turn next to Khaled Elgindy to talk about what I think is probably the leg of the trip that has the lowest expectations for a range of reasons. And I thought, Khaled, you could walk us through what you expect from President Biden's visit, not only to Israel, but then also, I believe he's going to Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank to meet with President Abbas, and you wrote your essay focused on that side of things. So Khaled, what's your take on that first leg of the trip and what to look for?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I mean, really, that first leg is sort of two legs, or maybe 1.5 legs. The first leg, the Israel leg, is central, of course, to the mission of this entire trip, the visit to Israel. And the second part of it, the visit to Palestine, is really kind of ancillary. It's not really central. So Biden is going to be meeting with Israeli and Palestinian leaders who are notably weak, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. On the Israeli side, as most of us know, the previous government has collapsed. New elections have been called for November. And the government is now headed by essentially a lame duck caretaker, Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who is the other half of the ruling coalition, taking over from Naftali Bennett last week. So the Biden visit is happening during kind of an unusual time, right? It's an Israeli election cycle, something that previous administrations have typically avoided for obvious reasons. The President Biden will be seeing the opposition leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, at least to avoid giving the impression that he's endorsing anyone in Israel's elections. The official line is, of course, that the United States does not intervene in the internal politics of any country, including Israel, though we know there are certainly precedents for that. Thinking back in particular to 1996 with Bill Clinton and Shimon Peres. But I do think that a major unspoken goal of this visit, at least on the Israel side, will be to boost the anti-Netanyahu bloc ahead of November elections. On the Palestinian side, of course, Mahmoud Abbas his weakness is much more chronic. His leadership has been in steady decline for more than a decade, but he's become especially unpopular since he canceled elections last year. We already knew going into this visit that the Palestinian issue was pretty low down the list of priorities for this administration. US officials really from the outset have made clear that there's no chance for restarting a political process, and they've instead focused on trying to improve things like the Palestinian quality of life. And they don't seem to be particularly concerned with Mahmoud Abbas's declining popularity or legitimacy. The meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, I think, is therefore really mostly just a courtesy call at best. The focus of the administration overall seems to be to reverse as much of the Trump legacy as possible on Israel and Palestine, but while expending the least amount of political capital. But even by this extremely low standard, the Biden approach to the Palestinians in particular has been extremely minimalistic. I think it hasn't even, I think a lot of people were expecting that Biden would restore a kind of status quo ante or an approximation of it, to the status quo that existed before the Trump era. But the reality has been far short of that. For example, in the president's op-ed that you referenced in the Washington Post, where he clearly lays out his priorities for the trip, and we heard from Karen and Mick about many of them. He never actually once mentions either a Palestinian state or the two-state solution, which is sort of remarkable in that it is at least up until now has been a standard talking point whenever the Middle East came up in broad terms. So the fact that this new and promising future that Biden is trying to lay out in this vision for this trip doesn't include even a rhetorical reference to two states and the Palestinian, I think, is quite notable. The reality is that with the exception of resuming formal relations with the Palestinians, restoring some aid, and the as yet unfulfilled promise to reopen the US consulate in Jerusalem, most of the previous administration's policies remain intact. And so while steps aimed at salvaging a two-state solution or trying to rescue Mahmoud Abbas from his failing leadership clearly would require a far greater political investment than this administration is prepared to make, there are lots of little things that the administration could do but hasn't done that would be fairly low cost, but for some reason we haven't seen, even at the declaratory level, things like simply calling for an end to Israel's occupation. That's a basic formula that Clinton, Bush, G.W. Bush, and Obama all did. Related to that, just explicitly repudiating the Trump plan, which remains the last official U.S. plan that is still on the books. Reversing a number of the previous administration's pro-settlement policies, like labeling settlement products as made in Israel, even though they are made in occupied territory. All of these things are sort of relatively low-hanging fruit that the administration could do, but seems unwilling to do, which I think really calls into question its commitment to even its rhetorical support for a two-state solution. Again, we're not talking about things that are going to restart a peace process or pick a fight with the Israelis, but really, really minimal things that I think, short of doing, it's very, very difficult to take this administration's support for a two-state solution at its word, especially since they couldn't see fit even to mention it in the president's op-ed.
Great. Thanks, Khaled. And I'm going to circle back to, and we have some good questions related to how to navigate this issue of also human rights and basic values and freedoms on this trip. A few months after President Biden himself hosted a summit for democracy, and Middle East is a tough part of the world, and we'll circle back to that. But I want to first, before we get to that, hear from Alex Vatanka, our Iran program director, because quite clearly, if you look at President Biden's first year and a half in office, he came into office and his priorities, understandably, were focused on the pandemic at home and the economic crisis America was facing, and then in the world defined his agenda in ways that Mick had mentioned in terms of great power competition, China and Russia, and quite clearly the Ukraine war has dominated much of the bandwidth in 2022 for the Biden administration. Also quite clearly, the Biden team is not where they want it to be with Iran. Their plan A on Iran and reentering the JCPOA has not worked out as they'd hoped. And I thought, Alex, I know you've been doing a lot of work on this, and your recent essay highlights some of these dynamics, but maybe you can paint the picture of what to expect on the Iran front in the region. How will Iran respond to this visit? What can we expect for U.S. policy as a plan B emerging from your perspective? And then we'll open it up to some questions and try to weave some of these issues together.
Thanks, Brian. Look, I think given the issue of time, maybe plan B, we can leave that for the conversation we have as a panel. But let me just take you to some of the sort of key issues that I've picked up in terms of Iranian assessments and views in terms of what's happening with President Biden's trip to the region. I have a number of bullet points. Forgive me for going through the bullet points, but again, given the limited time I have, these bullet points I've divided into sort of three groups. And let me just start off with the first one, which is the impact of this trip on the nuclear track. I looked hard. I don't see any Iranian assessments. We can critique this Iranian assessment, but I don't see any Iranian fears of any kind that suggests that Biden's visit will have any impact on the nuclear talks that are happening in Vienna or Doha. The fact is the Iranians have resisted all along, that they don't want the Gulf states or any other neighboring state to be a party to those nuclear talks. That is not changing. And I don't think the Iranians think that's on President Biden's agenda. So there will be no change of format. It'll be 5+1, as it has been the case since these talks pretty much began. There is no regional obstacle to a new nuclear deal. That's another important point. There are no issues relating to, say, the Gulf states or any other neighboring state that's in the way of a new nuclear deal. What's an obstacle essentially is about what I think is the real obstacle. And there's some debate about this, but I think it's really about what the Iranian side called verifiable economic sanctions relief. They want something that is more than paper. They want actually money in the bank account. Again, we can discuss that, but I think that's the key obstacle. The other point to point out is that the Gulf states particularly are already involved in one way or another, even though if they're not sitting in the talks. So countries like Qatar and Oman are clearly vested in this process and are acting as mediators, as we saw just a few weeks ago, about 10 days ago, with the last round of talks in Doha. The Omanis are constantly trying to mediate between US and Iran. And then we have another aspect to this Iran-Gulf relationship in the context of the Iranian nuclear program. For example, United Arab Emirates to this day remains one of Iran's largest trading partners. Now, one could imagine a scenario, certainly if you're sitting in Tehran, that's a scenario to ponder over, whether these dynamics could change if the diplomatic track completely collapses. I think one of the reasons why the Raisi government and Ayatollah Khamenei at the top in Iran have felt that they have some space to sort of delay, if you will, these talks, this is my personal view, is because the sanctions regime hasn't necessarily been enforced the way it could have been enforced. And that has created opportunities for the Iranians to trade, literally billions of dollars. I mean, Iran made about $25 billion in oil export income alone last year. It's enough to keep the regime going forward. And these dynamics could change depending on what President Biden gets out of his trip. Let me quickly go through the part about the regional agenda. Look, for the longest of time, Iran has dismissed all the notion of an Arab NATO or Middle East NATO against Iran. The Iranians haven't taken it seriously, and for good reasons. The Arab world, particularly the Gulf states, as we've seen in recent years, are not exactly speaking from the same page. There have been lots of conflicts among themselves. So the Iranians haven't taken it seriously. And I would say that was true up until a few days ago. But the notion of an integrated air defense system led by the United States, perhaps a brainchild of the Israelis, I don't know, but where the Gulf Arab states and others, perhaps like the Egyptians, the Jordanians join, that is something that has gotten Iran's attention. And that's something they don't like. And in fact, today they've come out and said this will be something they consider as a direct threat to them. And they're already now threatening neighboring states, saying, if you play ball with the Americans in this, the first ones, the closest neighbors to us who are party to this New Deal will be the ones we'll target when we feel our national security is endangered. So this to me suggests an Iranian fear that didn't exist before when we're talking rhetorically about, Arab NATO, Middle East NATO, which the Iranians didn't take seriously. The reality that Ayatollah Khamenei doesn't want to accept, the Revolutionary Guards people at the top who run Iran's regional agenda do not want to accept, is that it doesn't take President Biden come to the Middle East to mobilize the region against the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic's policies for 4 decades has mobilized the region against the Islamic Republic. So, frankly, sitting here talking about the way the Iranian officials do, that this is some sort of an American plot to come and divide the region to sell more arms, well, I think it would be perhaps prudent for the Iranian regime to look at their own regional policies that has mobilized countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE and so forth against them. So, but I don't see that debate happening, which takes me to that last point, Brian, I'll stop there, the domestic sentiment in Iran. I mean, with the exception of the office of the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, in this inner circle, and they are very powerful, clearly, and the Revolutionary Guards, top leadership. If you take these two out, and I know once you take them out, then who are the decision makers left? But the public sentiment, and I would say in good part of the sort of state machinery, if you just follow that sentiment and debate, there is a recognition that lack of direct talks with the United States is the reason why Iran is relatively isolated in the region. And people might take issue with that, saying Iran is not isolated, it has allies. But I will say Iran's allies are actually not serving Iranian national interests at the moment, at least not from the perspective of the Iranian public. Iran's allies, the proxies in the region, are nothing but a drain on the national interest and a liability, frankly, for an Iranian economy that is on the brink. And I think that's one of the key issues. And I end here. If President Biden figures out soon, I don't think it's going to happen on this trip, but it could happen by end of this year, that the diplomatic track with Iran is dead. There's no point trying to revive it. And they seek to enforce the sanctions regime, but also challenging Iran kinetically in the region. That would represent a whole new chapter for the Islamic Republic. And that's when they have to go back and maybe do another cost-benefit analysis and figure out if they're going to stay the course and maybe try something different, because they haven't really been tested, in terms of being confronted in the region. And if they are, I do have to wonder if that will make them change their mind. I'll stop there, Brian. Thanks.
That was great, Alex. And I want to thank the 4 of you, because just in the last 35, 40 minutes, we've covered a lot of territory. And it makes me wonder if we at MEI need to rethink our 60-minute online panels. I know we tried to do this in person in the hopes that we're moving to a post-pandemic period, but we have some challenges with that. And there's just so much that's rich that we could explore and delve deeply into. I'm tempted, because we have several questions on this issue of the traditional sort of interest versus values question. And Ishan Tharoor from the Washington Post asks in the Q&A a question about whether the two murders, the murder of the Saudi murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and then the murder of the Palestinian American journalist, both journalists Shireen Abu Akleh, whether those murders overshadow this trip, given President Biden's statements and his hope to frame the challenge in the world as one of democracies versus autocracies. And maybe I'll go back to Khaled first, and then Mick, you wrote about this in your essay a little bit, and you've served in government. And if others want to chime in, how does Biden navigate this? How does he not make this mistake, not only on the atrocious, murders of these two individuals who were journalists, but the broader challenges of human rights. And certainly, Alex, you might be able to say a few things about Iran as well as how that might be navigated. But maybe Khaled, back to you. I know you have very low expectations here, but what could President Biden do beyond sort of voice his support for a two-state solution? What are some other things that you might suggest on the Israel-Palestine leg of his trip that he can do to keep the values component on the agenda?
Yeah, thanks for that. Actually, one of the items that I mentioned in my essay that the administration can and should do is to call for an independent investigation into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. Up until now, the administration has avoided very assiduously using the term an independent investigation because there seems to be confidence in Israel basically investigating itself. Or in in the information that's already come to light. I think it's for a lot of Palestinians, they are making that connection between the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and the apparent double standard in the response. And the response has been very different. I mean, the Biden administration is, even as a campaign, was quite critical, as was most of the Washington political establishment following the very gruesome murder of Jamal Khashoggi. On contrast, they've been kind of loath to be critical of Israel, even after independent investigations by a number of media sources, from CNN to the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Associated Press, among others, all of whom come to the conclusion that she was most likely killed by, she was most likely targeted by an Israeli sniper. And the administration has avoided that, sort of gone out of its way to absolve Israel of any moral responsibility. So I think it's very important to Palestinians. I think it's important for just basic reasons of moral consistency that this administration call for an independent investigation and lay out some meaningful steps toward real accountability. And that's one of the key failings of US policy writ large when it comes to Israel and Palestine, is there are plenty of mechanisms for holding Palestinians accountable for all sorts of things, but there's really been no attempt to hold Israel accountable for pretty much anything.
Yeah, thanks, Khaled. And I also note in your essay that you do highlight also the autocratic tendencies inside the PA itself, too, right, which is one thing that I think impedes the process of political evolution there and a next generation come to power, in addition to the other challenges all Palestinians face from the Israel front. Mick, turning to you, and because you worked in the defense industry in the Pentagon, not the industry, but in the Pentagon, and oftentimes I think there's this, what I think is a false choice between interest and values, and you somewhat address this in your essay, but is there a way for the U.S. to deepen its security partnerships with countries across the region, ones you've worked with before, while also keeping these issues of human rights and values on the agenda? I mean, I have my view on it, and I certainly think that Vladimir Putin and Xi are unlikely in their engagements with the countries in the region to highlight democracy and human rights. But can we walk and chew gum at the same time on this front? And if so, how do we do that?
Well, I think we can, Ryan. And as you point out, and what I wrote in the essay was the U.S. should have a part of its foreign policy be human rights and civil liberties, period. And that includes on this trip. And I think that the U.S. being out there engaging is the best way to do that. The alternative would be we don't go, we don't engage. And then to your point, I think the most influence they'll have is between China and Russia. China, who has over 1 million people incarcerated for their religion, and Russia, who's killed over 20,000 innocent civilians in Ukraine right now. So I think that is something the U.S. should do and should accept. It could be some uncomfortable conversations, but that's just part of that role. Specifically, as you point out, I was at the Pentagon. I was in the military before that, and in the intelligence service. So I've worked with groups all over the world. One thing I think we do, and this could be part of this era of NATO, these training centers I brought up, is we bring expertise and professionalism, we hope, to those skill sets. But part of the professionalism is the abiding by the law of armed conflict. All of the things that the United States can and should be a part of and require of ourselves is what we teach when we train partners. If they're not doing that, then we need to rethink what it is we're training. So I think that's also an opportunity when it comes to, for example, how to conduct an air campaign in which we try to maximize the effects on the enemy and minimize, to extent even eliminate, the effects on innocent civilians. That's part of the way the U.S. conducts air campaigns, and that's the way we would teach it. That's the way it would be. I think the package and what we bring to the table when it comes to security assistance would include very much these human rights and these abiding by the law of armed conflict, etc. So I think that is together what the U.S. can do to help enhance human rights and civil liberties, and of course the abiding by the law of international conflict.
Great. I want to, thanks, Nick. I want to turn briefly to Alex on this question, because I mean, I'm of the view that Iran also faces substantial challenges on this front on human rights. And I'm also of the view that quite often that's not part of the discussion here in Washington, because we're understandably fixated and focused on the nuclear question, Iran's regional role. Are there ways that beyond rhetoric that the U.S. could actually reflect some of the concerns of the Iranian people and their desire for a different type of government, but not fall into that trap of the old trap of, oh, you're for regime change or for another war in the Middle East, and even just raising those issues? What do you think, Alex?
No, I think that's a very important question to ask, particularly as the United States is trying to figure out what its next steps will be, if there will be another attempt to sort of continue engaging with the Iranians diplomatically, and what else to bring into the conversation should this regime in Tehran be open to it. But I quickly go back to a point Mick made, and I think I totally agree with everything in terms of what he said and what he stands for. I think most of us obviously agree with that. That ought to be part of United States foreign policy. But I also want to say, I think the region right now, as the U.S. tries to sort of balance, that issue of interest versus values, they want to hear more about American interests and conversions with them over values. And I think that's my suspicion. And unfortunately, the role of Russia and China in the region, trying to sort of give them a way out, will complicate it for the United States. But I hope the United States does not give up, because I think that's what's unique about the United States, that it has values that it stands for. I think one can measure this issue in terms of the sentiments of the ruling classes in that part of the world, or the public sentiment in those countries as well. And I don't think we should forget, certainly the public out there, one of the things they aspire for is to sort of have United States values when it comes to things like human rights and civil liberties to be emulated by more parts of the world. Specifically, Brian, to your point about Iran, I mean, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as we all know, has a horrendous human rights record. There's no doubt about it. But you and I, as we are working on our paper, we've talked about it. You can have a nuclear deal and not give up on the basic human rights of the Iranian people. As hard as it is to have that conversation with the Islamic Republic, I think one thing that you could do, which will be almost at the minimum cost for this administration or the one that comes after, is have, if in a scenario where you have a nuclear deal, that you don't lift sanctions on individuals, on organizations that we know are involved in very nasty behavior against the citizens of Iran. So, sanctions would be something that you do. That's why the Biden administration rightly has refused to lift all the sanctions in one go. That's been the right approach. So I really hope that, the Iranian people, which is the biggest asset of the United States policy towards Iran, it's the sentiment of the Iranian people, that they're so tired of what's happening in their country to them by the ruling class there, not to forget that and look for ways to tap into that energy, because I think that will serve U.S. interests going forward in the long term.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Karen, I want to turn to you on a slightly different question, but please feel free if you want to add some thoughts on this topic. I'm just trying to move things along for the sake of time. Emily Meredith has this really interesting question, which she calls as niche, but I actually think does touch upon the broader regional dynamics that is the focus of this panel and Biden's visit. And she mentions the fraying of the JCPOA talks, not getting much anywhere. What are the discussions on Saudi nuclear energy, and I would guess more broadly too? She mentions the gold standard 123 agreement in line with what the UAE agreed to in the past. What's your expectation if Iran does move forward with its nuclear program, as it seems to, every day there seems to be a new headline here. And how does that impact, the broader sort of regional security sets of issues, but focus on the energy and nuclear energy aspect of it. And of course, feel free also if you want to add something on the values versus interests component as well.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Hi, Emily. Great question. On the interest versus values, I mean, look, I think this trip presents a very important opportunity for the Biden administration and for the press, right? I mean, there'll be a large contingent traveling with the president, the local press, but this is an opportunity for the administration to practice what it preaches, really engage with the press, answer those hard, uncomfortable questions. And that sets an example, and that pushes the other leaders standing next to President Biden to have to answer the question as well. So I think that's an interesting moment, and I hope that the press will continue to keep moving and keeping that issue at the forefront. To Emily's question, as I said, I fully anticipate that we are moving towards more of a hawkish confrontation within the region against Iran, that we will see more focus on militarization, on defense capabilities, on whether that's a shared missile defense, which the U.S. has been pushing in the Gulf for many years, somewhat unsuccessfully. But this is where we're headed, and that also transcends to nuclear energy for civilian use. We already have the precedent, of course, in the UAE. Saudi Arabia has been very, forthcoming. They would like to build nuclear power plants. Egypt has a very large nuclear power plant project, which is a Russian project, which has not gone very well. And so, yes, these are countries that together will be interested for lots of different reasons. In nuclear energy, and that I think will inevitably lead to more military capacity. That's the trend line. It's not good or bad, but that's where we're headed. And to Alex's point, on sanctions, the U.S. has not been enforcing oil sanctions against Iran, nor really against Russia, and so we have to make a decision, and that to me is actually also a values decision, because it's costly, right? And oil markets will not respond very favorably, but we have to make a decision if you are going to enforce, the parameters that you've set out as your policy. And we haven't been doing that. So that's a long-winded way of answering Emily's question to say that, yes, I expect more nuclear proliferation, whether for civilian energy or for weapons use. That's the attraction of the Israelis, of course, to many of these states as well, one of the attractions. The 123 agreement, the gold standard, which the UAE has, and its ability to produce nuclear energy, I don't think that we are seeing a real active discussion or engagement with Saudi Arabia on that. And I don't know that it's really part of this trip. But it could be, if things start looking a little better, that I think that is an area of potential U.S. engagement. And I would much rather see the U.S. facilitating nuclear power production in Saudi Arabia rather than other states who have come to the table offering solutions.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Running short on time here, and I'm going to ask my colleagues looking at the chat to try to keep a record of those that we don't cover and maybe try to circle back after the event is over. I wanted to ask one question, which relates to a little bit of my own surprise about the emphasis the Biden team has placed on the question of normalization and the potential for normalization. When the trip was announced last month, I noted some of the briefings that the White House had done had featured this a bit more, and certainly a lot more than, say, the Saudi embassy press release on this. And I thought there's perhaps a mismatch of expectations here in terms of prioritization and things like that. I wanted to ask each of you, and maybe starting first with Mick, then go Khaled, Alex, and Karen, and briefly, what are your expectations on not only the normalization front, especially US-Saudi? Is it coming on this trip? Is it coming soon? But then more broadly, the possibilities for regional cooperation on this front. And Mick, I already noted that Israel has moved from the European Command to the CENTCOM Middle East Command of the US. But what do you see likely in the next week, and then a little bit beyond, as succinctly as possible too?
So Brian, I do think that's one of the reasons for the trip. So I think that the effort's going to be made to make a better relationship with all the Gulf partners for the common interests of all the countries involved. I don't know exactly what normalization means. It seems that, quite frankly, at least from the defense and security side, we're still pretty much in the same positions we were before. And I do think that there will be an interest to some of the questions that I saw posted. I do think that from discussions with our partners that I've had, so it's somewhat anecdotal, but they are interested in this security training and kind of the security apparatus of the MESA agreement. They don't call it that. They weren't that interested in it, so it needs to be rebranded. But quite frankly, Central Command, U.S. Central Command was the primary on it before when it came to actually implementation. So the implementation of that is still very, very much resident in Central Command. It doesn't matter who the administration is, and they can do this. And I do think that will be a part of the discussion on what that could look like and what would be the benefit for the countries that agreed to participate.
Great, thanks. Khaled.
Yeah, thanks. I do think that normalization or the Abraham Accords in general is a big piece of this trip. I mean, the administration has made a big deal of the fact that president will be flying directly from Israel to Saudi Arabia, the first time that's happened, apparently. And of course, the language that the administration is pushing and has been pushing really since it came to office is a key goal in the region is to push Israel's integration in the region. And that is, that's subtext for normalization of one variety or another, not necessarily in the form of, formal, grand ceremonies and big agreements like what we saw in 2020 with the UAE and Bahrain, but even steps toward normalization, or what the administration refers to as a roadmap toward normalization. And it's clear that the Saudis are the big in that way. And the administration has played up that angle that this is good for Israel. Israel's integration and future normalization in the region is one of the reasons why they are going to Saudi Arabia. They've used that as a way to counter the criticism about the Saudi leg of this trip. So the only problem is that is, pushing the normalization track, which is clearly a bigger priority than the Palestinian track and two-state solution track, necessarily comes at the expense of that track. And so we don't know, how the administration intends to pursue Israel's integration while mitigating the damage to its stated goal of a two-state solution. And the fact that they've left it out of even their vision for this trip, I think only adds to that concern.
Yeah, great. Just briefly, Alex, I know your focus is Iran. I've noted that there's, at least here in Washington, the Israel-Palestine discussion is quite often disconnected from Iran, even though Israel and Iran are in a shadow war. And rhetorically, as Palestine is used by Iran's leaders. If there's even small steps, modest steps towards normalization, how do you think Iran's leadership would react to this? And how do you view the blending of these two issues, Israel, Palestine, and Iran?
Right. I don't think the Iranian leadership, including Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who cares about this more than anyone else, really has much of a choice here. He will not turning into a litmus test when it comes to, for example, continuing the diplomatic talks that Iran and Saudi Arabia have had now 5 rounds of. Or, turn around and say to a country like United Arab Emirates, I'm going to cut all trade with you because of your stance on Israel. The fact is that Iran didn't do that. UAE has not seen a decline in trade with Iran after the Abraham Accords. So the Iranians will hope that the Israelis will act in a foolish manner, that something bad happens in the West Bank or Gaza, that Arab public opinion will turn against those governments that have accepted Israel as a reality of the Middle East, and that Iran can benefit from it. But the Iranians are, in that sense, in the hopeful mode. I don't think they're going to turn this into a litmus test. I doubt they're going to do that.
Great. And we're running out of time here, but Karen, I know you visit the region regularly, you talk to folks. What do you see already happening on the energy and importantly, economic integration front? Do you see more openings already happening? Do you see more on the horizon?
With Israel?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's definitely plenty of business ties. There are expectations, broadening, particularly in Eastern Med gas business. Really, that's becoming so important to Europe. It's becoming a site of Gulf investment and cooperation. So, yeah, I mean, what's interesting to me about this trip, and as I think Khaled and Alex both rightly point out, this is really an Israeli agenda, which is sort of dominating, despite the fact that the Israeli government is sort of dysfunctional. So it's quite an achievement. But yes, I mean, there is optimism about the potential for economic cooperation, and I think now it is normalized. So the diplomacy, the people-to-people ties, that will take longer, but the bridge has been crossed.
Great. Well, Karen, Alex, Khaled, Mick, thank you for your time and expertise here. We were talking about Biden's trip in advance. Of course, it's yet to unfold. We're all available, as is the rest of our team that took part in this analysis that we put out last week. You can find it at mei.edu, as well as those of you who may have missed this live stream. Hopefully you're watching afterwards. So stay tuned. We'll all be watching very carefully what happens on this trip, and then more importantly, the follow-ups and then sort of the longer term steps that are made by actors in the region, as well as US policymakers. So thanks for joining us here at MEI, and join us again a couple of times this week at our wonderful events that I mentioned at the outset. Thanks again. This is Brian Catullo signing off.